Hey everybody, welcome back to the Japanese garden, the Planet Coaster project with no coasters and pretty much no buildings either. But today I won't be working on just terraforming and foliage though. Today I'll be adding some bridges into the garden and creating some new landscapes. So, it's something slightly different from last time, so without further ado, let's get into the time-lapse. Alright, now the first few bridges that I'll be making are these really small ones along the side of this path here. There are just two bridges, but they're also the same bridge, just copied over twice, so it's not really something that I would call two different bridges. In total, I'll be working on 3 bridges throughout the garden in this episode, and along with that, doing all of the foliage and finishing up the terraforming and rock work and everything in this part of the garden. Now, the general idea behind this episode as a whole is that a lot of Japanese gardens tend to recreate some main scenes in Japanese landscapes. So a lot of gardens tend to create Mount Fuji, only in a very small scale, or at least make a hill that's very similar to and named after Mount Fuji. Or they'll be making a tea house that looks very much like a very famous tea house somewhere else in the country, or even a set of stairs up a hill that is modeled after a different set of stairs somewhere else. So it's a lot of taking Japanese monuments and scattering them throughout gardens to sort of recreate miniature scenes of very famous parts of Japan. And I basically took this idea as a reason to just copy over things from Japan and put them into the garden, so I wouldn't have to come up with just my whole own design for these bridges, but instead just make these bridges based on existing Japanese designs, which for one, you know, it makes it a bit more accurate, since I wouldn't really know how to come up with a bridge design that is actually fittingly Japanese, but not one that doesn't already exist. But at the same time, it's just a free way to just copy over things that already exist, which normally I try to do this as few as possible. I try to never copy something over, just gather some general information and inspiration from the theme that I'm trying to do, and just trying to work out something completely unique based on that. But in this case, I'm just recreating existing objects and scenes, and in this case, the bridge that I'm making here and the environment around it is based on Suizenji Garden in Kumamoto. And I have to be very honest, I don't really know Kumamoto from very much. I just know they have a very famous castle, they have this garden, and they're super famous for their mascot, which is absolutely one of the cutest mascots, probably the cutest mascot for a prefecture ever. It's pretty much also what it's generally known for, apparently. But it's the garden that they have is really sweet. I would actually love to go there one day. I probably won't, because it's very far away and it's difficult to get there. But they have a beautiful castle, beautiful city, and it's overall just one of those places in Japan which isn't as touristy as, say, places like Tokyo and Kyoto, but still seems like something that's worth a visit if you've already seen these things. Anyway, I'm modeling this part after this garden called Suizenji, which has this section with these bridges and this path leading over them and connecting these little islands, which, other than that, is just a very typical Japanese garden scene. Some rock work scattered throughout these bridges and some simple foliage around them. Some of these manicured bushes and some Japanese pine trees. So it's a sort of typical scene, but I thought it would work quite well over here, especially given that I have this large lake and this garden in Kumamoto also features a lake like this. What I even took as inspiration for this, but what I'll probably change later on, is that in the distance on the other side of the lake there is Mount Fuji, and Suizenji Garden also has a super similar setup where you see Mount Fuji at the end of the lake as you cross these bridges. But it's something that I probably won't be recreating in this garden, since I think there's a little bit more that I can do with that mountain rather than just leaving it completely empty, because in this garden in Kumamoto, the Mount Fuji miniature recreation hill is completely devoid of any foliage. It's just grass, and I think it'd be more interesting to actually add some trees on it, have a path go to the top of the hill, and do something on top of the hill that you can actually use it as a way to look over the rest of the garden. Which I'll probably get back to later when I actually do that. That's just a future plan and not something that I've built so far. But it's just something I want to keep in the back of my head as one of the plans for making the rest of this garden. Now over here I experimented a little bit with making a wooden coastline, just by putting some wooden posts on the side and holding back the land like that. It's something which you do see in some gardens. There's multiple ways in which you can make that border between the water and land. You could just have nothing, or you can have some beaches, or you can have some rock work, or you can have like stone or concrete walls. But I also think it's quite interesting to mess around with the idea of just placing wooden walls in there. But it's not something that I'll do more in the rest of this garden. I think I like the look of the rock work along the side of the water a little bit more. Anyway, that's just about it for that little scene. So really in the sort of sense of a Japanese garden, you've got these different scenes throughout the landscape, and in each of them you've sort of got a different area to picture. And in this case I wanted to move to another area and work on something else, and in this part I'll be recreating, or more or less recreating, the general atmosphere of a place called Nikko, which is north of Tokyo. It's quite far away from Tokyo, but it's quite famous for featuring some really old, really beautiful and super detailed shrines and temples. And it also has this bridge, which is quite famous. Oh, apparently I'm not going to work on that quite yet. Well, never mind. I completely lost track of what I was doing in my time-lapse. We'll get back to that later. But for now, I'm working on this very quick stone bridge, which isn't actually going to be all that much. I'll be back to Nikko very quickly. But over here, I wanted to have this stone bridge, which is based on a bridge in Kyushibarikyu Garden in Tokyo, which is the one place that I've actually been here. And it's just a simple stone platform leading across the lake, with, in the middle of that platform, kind of toward the side, an opening with a small rounded stone bridge, so that there's actually a part where the water can actually pass through. It's a very simple bridge, but it's something which I wanted to try, and given the future sightlines of the garden, I think it'll look pretty neat. Also, yeah, I'm trying to make my stone bridges out of wood. It's something which I did with the earlier bridge as well. There just isn't anything that's made out of stone in Planet Coaster that's small enough to really create these round bridge features, especially not the small posts. So I just have to opt for making wooden posts look kind of like stone by going for a similar color. But it's still not exactly perfect. I just hope that with the context of all the textures around it being out of actual stone and looking very much like stone, that the wooden posts can at least look stone-ish enough to pass for a stone bridge, basically. Now, back to the thing that I was originally going to work on. I wanted to create two ways to get to the other side, mainly because in-game it's not possible to make your guests actually walk over these rocks. But I thought for one it would be interesting to have this rocky way of passing the river. It's something that you see quite often in Japanese gardens, whether it would just be a rocky path alongside a lake or a rocky path to actually cross a small river. It's always something that, you know, you see in nature and it's quite neat to recreate, so I thought I would do that over there. But eventually, since this is Planet Coaster, I will need some actual paths to get people to the other side, but that's just about something that I'm gonna do anyway as well, since I'm gonna build a bridge on the top of this little valley over here. Now the valley isn't exactly a river, but I wanted to make it look kind of similar. You've got these little miniature mountains in the back with this little valley between them, so it sort of recreates the idea of having a small stream that comes down from the mountains and has a bridge right at the top over there. Trying to use a bit of forced perspective by placing small bushes and trees at the forefront to make this actually look like a proper valley and like you're actually going up the mountains, whereas the actual height difference for the paths is just about like 3 or 4 meters. It's really all quite small, so I'm gonna have to use the foliage to my advantage to make this all look larger than it really is and to create the illusion of having more of a mountain-like landscape, even though it's all very low. But yeah, that's really the idea. Sort of stream coming down from the mountains with this bridge at the top of it. And I mentioned Nikko earlier because the bridge is going to be modeled after the Shinko bridge. No, I almost just said something really bad. It's going to be modeled after the Shinkyo bridge in Nikko. You can tell how horrible my Japanese is even after half a year of being here and having Japanese classes every weekday. It's crazy. I'm sorry, Japanese people. I'm horrible. Anyway, so it's modeled after the Shinkyo bridge in Nikko, and it's just one of the most beautiful bridges in Japan, generally seen as that at least. I unfortunately haven't been there. Really wish that I did, but right now I don't really quite have the time for it. I'm sort of prioritizing theme park visits over it. But it's a really beautiful bridge anyway. Used to be part of a shrine, I believe, over there, and was only open to the public a few decades ago. But by now it's one of the major tourist destinations over there, and there's lots of beautiful pictures on this on the internet. It's a really beautiful bridge. And I basically wanted to recreate it, because it's one of these more typical Japanese style bridges that you'll see in a lot of movies or Japanese inspired cultural items, where the bridge is rounded and has a red fence with all this detailing on it. That's the sort of bridge that this is. Whereas the earlier stone bridges that I've made so far are really just much more simple designs. So yeah, this will also more or less be one of the signature viewpoints, or I guess you could even say weenies, of this garden. Plus, I just wanted to make this because it seemed like a fun experiment. I've always wanted to try making a bridge like this, but I've never quite done it. I've done a few similar ideas in Fantasy Valley. God, that's a long time ago. But it was never quite the way that I liked it, especially since the pieces were pretty limited back then. And now we can actually recolor everything to get the colors that we are looking for. So yeah, this is slightly different from what I've done so far, and definitely one of the things in the garden which I am the most happy with. I'm quite happy with how it turned out in the end, even if it's still pretty simple. I think it convincingly looks like a Japanese bridge, and it's quite similar to the Shinkyo bridge. Even if it's not exactly the same, it's much smaller, it has slightly different details, but I think the general feeling is very similar. So now into the rock work and the foliage to make this look like it's an actual mountain valley. I decided to have some more mud and stuff like that, these different textures at the bottom of the valley to make it actually kind of look like a small stream running down the hill. I chose not to have an actual waterfall down there, since I thought for now that might not be very necessary and just look weird, and I think I prefer the dry look, but maybe I'll change that in the future. I'm definitely open to any kind of suggestions or ideas, but for now I think, especially given that in Planet Coaster, if you have this light coming from the opposite side and this whole valley is going to be in the shadow, the water textures, I think, of the water fountains that you can use to make that sort of stream coming down the hill are just going to look a little bit weird. I honestly had the same feeling about the volcano in Koali Beach, and I still regret adding waterfalls to that thing because the textures don't quite work out well, especially in the shadow. So for now, just to make everything look a bit more realistic, I'm just gonna keep it dry and just focus on the foliage and the rock work to make this look like a mountain landscape. Now, as for the foliage, this was one of the most difficult things to actually make it work, since the paths were really close to the valley, and I wasn't really planning on making them that close, but there's no other direction that I can really make the paths in, since I decided to draw a border of this garden before I started working on the garden, so I really don't have more space to work around with here. Which is kind of good because it forces you to get into the small spaces and try to use the space as much as you can, which in a real life Japanese garden they should have done as well, since these gardens are quite small and definitely much more small than they feel. So in order to kind of alleviate that issue, many of the trees that I'm using around the riverside here are very small. For one, so I can fit them in, but also so that the whole scene looks a little bit larger than it really is. Especially since the trees that I'll be placing toward the back to actually make the forest are gonna be quite a bit larger. So in the whole context of things, I think it should look pretty decent with having these very small trees around the river and in the front alongside this rockwork bridge that we have going over the river, and then putting the larger trees in the back to actually make up the forest itself. To be honest, this project for me is also a little bit of a practice in making foliage, and I think some of the ideas in here can definitely be applied to theme parks. I've talked about nature already and how it kind of relates to theme parks, that you're trying to create a scene that looks like nature, but you're arranging it in a very man-made way to make it look good. And I think that very idea definitely translates into theme parks, but also some of the ways of using the planet coaster foliage, like using the smaller trees to give some detailing to forests, or ways of using small trees and shrubs and sinking them into the ground to create some low shrubbery detailing. I think things like that will definitely translate into any kind of theme park foliage as well. Oh well, I guess it depends on what kind of theme park you're going for. If you're going for a Six Flags park or something like that, might want to just keep it more simple. Plus, Western gardening is quite a bit different, so that's still something to keep in mind with, but through this project I'm definitely forcing myself to use the foliage in Planet Coaster in a way different way than I normally would, and I think there's always something that you can take away from trying projects in a completely different style that you've never tried before. Even if you completely suck at it, and if it doesn't turn out the way that you like it, you still get to learn the pieces a little bit more, and you still get to get a bit better by just going outside the box, so that once that you're inside the box, at least you can apply some of the tricks that you've learned by trying something else that you did. As for me, for example, I think I've gotten a little bit better through this project at mixing foliage and rockwork when it's just very minimal rockwork, just a few little bits and bobs over here, and adding some small bushes and shrubs around that. It's something which I always just kind of did randomly, but I think especially through learning how to do it a bit more organic in a Japanese garden, I think I can get a little bit better at it and apply that in the future in some of the other theme parks that I'll be building. Plus, making shrubs out of very small shrubs and just clustering them all together until you have a larger shrub is something which I never really did to the extent that I've done here, but which works out quite well. Especially on some of the shrubs that I'm placing over here on this little hill are fitting together quite well, I think, even though none of them are actually real in-game items. They're all sort of mixes of smaller ones all clustered together. Anyway, I think that's just about it for foliage. There's something which I wanted to return to talk about in this video, which is the name of this garden. I know I didn't talk about it that much in the last episode, but the name is it's not that great, honestly. Then again, I'm also the person who came up with Bone Shaker and Grapefruit. I'm not sure to what extent I'll ever get out of that bad name habit, but the inspiration for this name came basically from the word Kawako, which stands for a river spirit, at least a small one. Like, Kawa means river, and ko is something that you add to the end of a word to make it small, so to speak. So that's where that came from. And then the N at the end is just for Teien, which is the word for garden. It's not actually koen as in a park, because, god, that's one of those confusing things. If you have a long ko, as in koen, something would be a park, whereas this is just koen, which is short ko, and there's not really much of a meaning behind that. It's just naming things. Basically, I chose the name because I thought it sounded pretty awesome and had no regard for what it would actually sound like to an actual Japanese person. I honestly wouldn't be able to really quite tell, and I expected that no Japanese people would actually reply and find this, but they did, and I gotta say, I'm sorry for my bad naming. It's something that turns out works in every language. I'm just horrible at naming things in every language. Anyway, that basically more or less kind of explains this garden. There's no particular meaning behind it because there's no particular place which this garden would be located at. I didn't really come up with any particular city or even prefecture where this would be. It's just something which I thought sounded pretty cool. That said, by the way, and this is a little bit off topic, but still something that's been on my mind recently, and I just wanted to drop in a video because it's something that doesn't get a lot of attention, but recently has been picking up quite a bit of momentum, and it's just generally what I'm talking about is the Japanese Planet Coaster community, which, as it turns out, is much bigger than I thought it was. I thought it was basically non-existent up until a few weeks ago, with just a few players playing this game in Planet Coaster perhaps. But recently we've seen the Alien the Ride blowing up, and if you haven't seen this yet, by the way, you have to see Aliens the Ride. It's such a good dark ride. I'm sure if you actually look for this on YouTube you can find it. It has many views, but I'll link it down in the description as well. But this is one of the things which made me realize that there's quite a Japanese language community behind Planet Coaster as well. And normally, I already know that the international community for Planet Coaster is really big, but the general community speaks English as their main language. Doesn't matter whether you're from the Netherlands or UK or the US, there's a lot of crossover between all of these local communities because they speak English, and there's sort of this general English hub of Planet Coaster content where all the best stuff gets shared and gets known by everybody. But I feel like because of the language barrier, because Japanese is really hard to learn if you're not speaking it, and if you're not from Asia, for instance, because it might be a bit easier if you're from China, but vice versa it goes as well. Barely anyone who's not from Japan doesn't speak or speaks Japanese, since it's really hard to learn these languages, and so there's really barely any crossover between these two communities, even though there's some really amazing stuff coming from Japanese Planet Coaster players. So I'm not entirely sure where I'm going with this discussion, but I've just been sort of hoping the last few weeks that it becomes easier to find some crossover between these communities, since even though we might speak completely different languages and have trouble connecting to each other, I think it's safe to say that really great Planet Coaster community creations are pretty universal, and creativity is pretty universal, which I guess gets shown off by Aliens the Ride as well, by being so popular across the world. So I really hope that there's gonna be a bit more connection between these two, and hopefully I can figure out a bit more what's going on in the Japanese community, because it's just really cool to see that stuff. It's also interesting because they've seemingly developed a little bit more apart, since they don't really communicate that much with each other, that there's slightly different sort of styles and a slightly different sort of atmosphere in both parts. But yeah, I might dig into this a little bit, just because I think it's really interesting, but also because I think there's bound to be a lot of really amazing stuff which doesn't really get to be known outside of Japan as much because of that language barrier. For instance, I logged into Nico Nico to actually check out Aliens the Ride, and it turns out there are many videos, even recently, of Planet Coaster with hundreds of thousands of views back there, which is just really amazing. Never really knew that it was this big. I think actually I've heard that the merchandise creator of Planet Coaster, the Frontier store, now has Korean and Japanese language options. I never actually found that out, but it's pretty cool if it does. I think it's really interesting. I remember back in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 days there was also a really active Korean community, which had barely any interaction with the English community, but there were some really amazing projects that came out of there, but you just had to search really hard to find them because of that language barrier. Anyway, that's wildly off topic. Maybe I'll relate this back someday when maybe someday I'll be reviewing some of this stuff or sharing it in any kind of way. Plus they're bound to be way better at making Japanese gardens than I am, just trying to add a bunch of this rock work alongside the river. Yeah, let's get back on topic. So the last thing that I'll be working on is creating this little area between the bridges that I made earlier and the bridge between the valley. It's not really too complicated, but it's a Riverside where I decided to add a bit more rock work than in the other areas, and also keep this space a little bit more open. It's slightly different in terms of foliage, a little bit more regular trees, but that said, I'm not really experimenting yet with making actual forest paths, but I definitely want to do so in the future. It's just that I've been like sort of struggling trying to find out what I can best do with the foliage in the game. So for instance, some Japanese gardens will have these paths that lead on a small trail between these super tall bamboo forests, and I've tried this in Planet Coaster, but it doesn't quite work out with the foliage that I have so far. So there are just some things which I want to try in terms of landscape, but doesn't really work out that well because it doesn't work with the foliage in the game, or the foliage isn't really made for it, or it doesn't fit the foliage that I already have in the park. So it's a bit of a struggle. But at some point, I do want to move away a little bit from what I'm doing right now, and moving away from all the open places, all the manicured bushes and the Japanese pine trees, and actually move into some actual forest trails. Because you'll definitely find in some Japanese gardens some little paths that just lead into dense forest with just trees all around, and that's something which I kind of want to get to into in this garden as well. You know, little paths that you can actually get lost in, because everything so far is pretty open and pretty easy to get around, and I want to start hiding some stuff as well. That's actually what I quite like about these gardens as well. God, I'm gonna go on a nerd rant as well, but yeah, you can walk into the garden, feel like you can see everything, because it really seems that way. Like when you walk into a garden, everything is really open, and it's all presented to you in a very open and clear sort of way. But when you actually get into it, and when you walk down all of the paths, there are always these places that you can't see initially, where as you walk through it, the trees suddenly open and you're in this new area that you'd never even expected before. And it's that sort of feeling which I haven't really gotten into in this garden yet. Everything is quite safe and quite predictable. But that's something for the next episodes. So far, just want to get the main stuff in. And the last thing that I'll be working on in this episode is something which should make this path not completely useless. I wanted to have something at the end of this path going up the mountains, so we have a small observation platform, which isn't so much an observation platform, but just a place where you can stand and take pictures, or maybe sit and just watch the landscape. It's really one of these designated sort of photo posing places that I wanted to add here and there in the garden. It's inspired by this little place that I found in Korakuen Garden, which is close to Tokyo Dome City in Tokyo. Where else? Which also has this similar idea. It presents this little wooden platform right on top of a hill, which looks out on one of the main views of the garden. And I think it's just those views that sometimes are exactly what you need as you walk into a garden and you're always underneath the trees and you're always walking alongside the foliage. It's sometimes really cool to just get up to this hill and suddenly be above everything and have this huge view over everything else. So yeah, that's something which I wanted to have right there. The platform itself isn't really that good looking, and I'm also trying to hide it a little bit with the foliage around it. It's really just about the view that you have from there that's important. Now with that said, that's the end of this episode, so thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time, in which I'll be working on the tea house at the side of the lake. Bye guys!